I've been seeing a lot of controversy around Daggerheart, especially when it comes to their initiative system. And I gotta say, it's a big skill issue, right? But that's actually a big problem. Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and I have been thinking a lot about all this conversation around Daggerheart. And to be honest, a lot of it is frustrating. It's frustrating for people on both sides of the fence, for the people who like Daggerheart and how it runs, and for the people who don't like some of the aspects of the game. And the thing that I'm noticing very commonly is a lot of people like some of the ideas around it, but they get hung up on certain issues, and a lot of the time it's based purely on speculative behavior. So, what am I talking about? Let's give some context here, especially when it comes to the initiative. So, in Daggerheart, if you're unaware, there is a non initiative system. When combat starts, the players can instantly start role playing and can take as many actions as they want. And when many people are hearing this, they're just imagining worst case scenarios. What if a player just doesn't shut up and continuously uses actions? What if a player isn't good about speaking up and doesn't get a chance to act in combat? Well, these are both legitimate issues on some tables. You have to understand that this is not a new initiative system by any means. In fact, some of the most popular TTRPGs out on the market, whether it's Powered by the Apocalypse, whether it's Blades in the Dark, or Monster of the Week, whatever, many games actually have this same aspect. Though Daggerheart actually gives you more to work with when it comes to it. So, an example I can really give is Monster of the Week is a game that I play somewhat regularly, about every week, and it doesn't have an initiative system. The players can kind of just do whatever, because in the end of the day, the monsters don't actually get the chance to take the initiative. A player makes a roll for their turn on whatever they're doing, attacking the monster or whatever, and they get attacked back if they get a mixed success. And only when they roll a critical success or a pure success can they actually avoid the damage that a monster can do. Meaning that every time a player takes an action, there's always a reaction of some kind. That's how they do initiative, and that's how they keep the ball in the player's court as much as possible. The same thing more or less happens with Powered by the Apocalypse or Blades in the Dark, where you run into a combat scenario, but in all actuality, it's just the game reacting to whatever the players do. So why is Daggerheart different? Well, Daggerheart has a similar premise, especially when it comes to like failing with fear, or even success with fear, or yeah, success with fear as well. And the thing about it is, people just, one, I'm seeing a lot of people also just talking about like how this is how the system is going to run without ever actually trying the system. Daggerheart's one of those very few games I don't feel like you can accurately say how the game will play without actually playing it. And we have played it here on the channel. You can actually go check that out on our live tab. The thing is that there is this a lot of speculation based on the worst possible outcomes. And that is causing a lot of problems, and it's actually preventing people from seeing the actual issues that the game has. Now, I did a review recently, and I did talk about how this game is very focused on the GM's competency to run a game. And the initiative system is somewhat similar to that part of this equation, rather. During combat, the players are, and it's encouraged many, many times in the book, are encouraged to make sure everyone gets a turn, that to be conscious of this. This is a part of the experience, and it's an expectation that the book is putting on the players, and it's something that should be communicated to the players as well. So if a player is going, nuclear and is actively doing a bunch of things, then either it wasn't communicated to them, which honestly could be the GM's fault for not actively saying it, or the player is just honestly someone who's being very disrespectful to the rest of the table. That's a social issue. That's a situation that can't be solved by the book, and that's something that needs to be either properly communicated and dealt with, or you need to play games that can rein that player in if you absolutely refuse to exclude this player from your games. Like, that's what it boils down to, right? Every tabletop game is a social contract. And the thing is, many of the problems people are having with Daggerheart are things that are already a part of tabletop, even in the crunchiest of games. Because the thing is that in Daggerheart's initiative system, which is not only just for combat, I might add, but can be for other social situations as well, whenever there's kind of some stakes on the line based on time. That's just what happens during normal social parts of tabletop. When your team is out talking in town, going to the merchant, for instance, all kinds of things. And do you feel like one of your players during these non initiative parts of the game are just hogging the spotlight the whole time? If the answer is yes, then that's a problem and you should fix it, right? So why is it an issue for Daggerheart? And like I said, it's a lot of speculative, worst possible case scenario expectation from players that really doesn't give credit to other players. And it requires that if these issues do come up, that the GMs step up and make sure everything, goes narratively. The thing is that Daggerheart's initiative system can be played pretty much like Lancer's initiative system if you really want to. Every time a player acts, the GM gets an action token that they can then use to have an enemy take an action. And if you want to go by what their intent is in the book, all that needs to happen is a player needs to roll with fear for the initiative to kind of shift sides to the GM side, where they can spend tokens equal to, or up to at least, how many tokens they have. So, like, you can do player act, GM act, player act, GM act. You can really do that, and it really doesn't change the overall balance of the game system. The fact is that the combat is very balanced because there's no player actions not being accounted for. Because even if the GM is running low on NPCs, for instance, in a combat encounter, they can opt to take extra action tokens to make the character do bigger things, or to combine them to change fear so the GM can make some moves on the GM side. There's no way to really make the combat ever unbalanced to one side of the combat. That's actually a pretty good thing, though the book does heavily dissuade you from having an NPC act multiple times. You can do so, or like I said, you can make GM moves, which are not NPC actions, to kind of get around that, to kind of keep the balance as fair as the GM sees fit. We had a lot of combat actually in our live play, and what it kind of boiled down to was mostly it was the players. I had to keep prompting my players to take actions or to like be the next person to go, because this is just not the kind of game we play. We play a lot of games that use initiative systems, honestly. And it never caused a problem, not once. And that's because, I tend to play with people I enjoy playing with, which means playing with people who are not like narcissistic assholes who take all the spotlight for themselves. You know what I mean? So it's a skill issue. It's a skill issue on the player's side as well as the GM side. Your players should be allowing turns for everyone else, making sure everyone goes. It's a collaborative narrative experience. If you're playing with competitive players who are doing nothing but wanting to take advantage of the system, then yeah, Daggerheart's probably not for you. But the thing is it's a rules light kind of narrative game with some crunch kind of added on top to give a little bit more impact to player choice. And that's another part about this whole thing, maybe another video. A lot of people who are upset at the crunch mixed in with the narrative. Lancer, a very tactical, crunchy game, has rules light elements that it uses for the pilots. Actually, something that I personally have a problem with, because I feel like the pilots don't offer a ton to the narrative in comparison. But there's a lot of people who like that aspect of Lancer, that they can just do kind of whatever with their pilots. And, it works there. And again, in most tabletop situations, you do have a somewhat rules light function, because there's a lot of times where the player's like, hey, GM, can I do this? GM's like, yeah, okay, go ahead and roll for it. And player does. And that's all the mechanics that are on top of it, right? The narrative style for Daggerheart allows for a lot of that kind of behavior. And in combat, what it allows for you to do is actually have guidance on what you can do in a combat round, and mechanics that can support your actions to kind of make a narrative more interesting. One example of this is I have a player who has a reaction, essentially, that they can jump in front of an attack meant for an ally and then rebound all that damage back on the enemy. And that's something that's really, really cool. Now, if you were doing a normal rules like game, there's sometimes you'll have a move in a game, if you're familiar with like Powered by the Apocalypse or Blades in the Dark, that allow you to do something kind of similar. But this is just a little bit more mechanically tuned, so that it's very obvious what the player can do and it's not very vague. This provides, in a situation where it's kind of more competitive, more high action, guidance for the players and for the GM. And for the few domain powers in Daggerheart that allow you to do things like outside of combat, like for instance, being more persuasive and being able to spend hope to gain advantage while talking to an NPC, for instance, that's just another choice that the player can choose to be better at a particular thing. And that extra little bit of crunch is really not that much. And in fact, the whole hope and fear system is, again, just a little bit of hope or a little bit of crunch that adds just a little bit extra without being too much. In Pathfinder, for instance, which is a much crunchier game, when you make a persuasion check on an NPC, you have to go and consult the like helpfulness table or whatever it's called. I can't remember at this moment. It's not really important. But you can see you can improve their like opinion of you by 1 or even 2 degrees. So you have to actually go find a table, look at that, and see what those degrees mean. And that's just a lot. And that's a lot in comparison to Daggerheart, which is just, I am more persuasive, so I gain an extra D6 if I spend hope, which is not a lot of extra crunch, in all honesty. If you want a crunchier game, that's completely fine. People are saying criticisms for a game for talking about aspects that are more about preference than it is about actual criticisms of the game. A legitimate criticism of how Daggerheart does things is it requires a lot of GM fiat. The GM has to be able to arbitrate a situation by coming up with results. Like, success with failure is something that is kind of frustrating, in my opinion, because it means there's some kind of consequence. Whether it's, like you succeed the check, but you might have to spend extra stress, like they give an example for in the book, or you succeed the check, but the enemies are made like on high alert that you didn't get found, but the enemies are like, something's going on here, and they become a little bit more perceptive. It's something that it takes a really talented GM to make sure that the consequences are fitting for the narrative in the scene. And in addition to that, in combat, the GM needs the ability to mark when player action should end and when they should jump in, or when they should use a move that keeps the combat interesting and interactive, and not just make a turn to turn kind of thing. Because that's the great thing about Daggerheart's combat, is it can be super narrative and the action can be popping the whole time, and it doesn't just become this kind of dull, almost monotonous thing of player goes, NPC goes, player goes, NPC goes. Because the thing is that you can do very interesting things with the narrative. A player can have a whole action scene if you so deem to. And that's very, very cool. And it stays balanced. And all you have to do is just make sure that every player gets a chance to be in the spotlight. And because there is no initiative system, players can't just sit on their phone waiting for their turn. They actually need to pay attention to the story so that they can attempt to hop in when that comes up. And of course, for the players who are less inclined to do that, it's up to the other players and the GM to ensure that that player is noticed. And sometimes a player goes under the radar. You just, a lot is going on, the GM loses concentration. So a very valid criticism is it's a skill issue that running this game is actually somewhat difficult for your everyday GM because there's just a lot of, you have to make a lot of choices, and so a good GM and a bad GM are very evident the longer a game goes on. Where in games like D&D or Pathfinder or something, a good GM and a bad GM are a bit harder to find because as long as they're following the rules, like the game still operates more or less the same. And that's just something that I feel like a lot of people are not doing when it comes to Daggerheart. A lot of people are saying, I don't like this because I'm neurodivergent and can't I can't operate in a system that doesn't give me a turn system. Okay, that's fair. You can just not like the game and prefer something that gives you something, a mechanic that you need to lean on more. That's fine. That's fine, but that's not a criticism of the game because that's not what the game is trying to do. You're not helping the intent behind the game. You're just stating your opinion that you don't like a thing that the game is doing, you know? Other criticisms I've seen that are very kind of just without base is this game uses a lot of systems from other games, and it feels like it needs to stick in either the rules light or crunchy path. Why? Why can there be no blending between the two? Like this particular criticism doesn't actually talk about how what can be done differently. They just don't like the idea of narrative and mechanic blending together more in some situations. And they can say, well, we're on a nice flow, but rather than having one dice check, we need to spend hope and roll a die, and that just adds a lot of extra stuff. Or we just need to, like, we're doing combat, but then we need to roll dice. Like, every game that has any kind of combat typically rolls dice or has to resolve some kind of mechanic in order to get it done. So, what are you asking for? What about the mechanics are not really jiving with you? Like the damage is also just a check system. You don't have to do math in this game. All you have to do is look at the damage thresholds and be like, is damage higher than threshold but less than other threshold? Then you mark one or two up to 3 boxes, maybe 4 boxes if you use an optional rule. Like, it's very light on the rules, and there's not a lot of actual crunch because there's not a lot of actual math that goes into it other than like how much armor score you have, which is something that should be done before the combat starts. What I'm saying here, and sorry if this video's been a little rambling, a little long, is it's very legitimate that you don't like Daggerheart because it doesn't offer you enough support. I think that, in the end of the day, is a legitimate criticism of the game that is something that can't be easily solved because the whole point is it's narrative free flow. You're supposed to be able to tell whatever story you have and use your abilities to kind of enhance that. When a magic caster in this game uses a spell, it has a specific effect. Unlike other games like Monster of the Week, for instance, where the player can kind of just come up with whatever effect, and the GM is like, yeah, sure, or that seems like a little too much, rein it back. This game actually gives a lot of, direction, allowing for play to actually be smoother. So, if you don't like the game because it doesn't offer you or you don't feel like it works well with your group, that's fair, but a criticism isn't I don't like it. A criticism needs to be what about this can change or what about this doesn't suit the direction the game is going. And I'm not expecting everyone to be a master of tabletop to know all these tabletop games or whatever. It's just stop acting like your opinion is something that needs to be listened to make a game good. Because in the end of the day, it's just your opinion. You can dislike the game, and it's okay to say, I dislike Daggerheart, but don't act like the initiative is a mandate of tabletop because it hasn't been, and it hasn't been for a really long time. And the fact that you don't understand how it works doesn't mean that it's a broken system in the game. So, people are not going to like that outcome. That's fine. You guys can be angry at me, and I think that's very valid. I'm not trying to invalidate how you play the game. I'm not trying to say that you're bad at tabletop either. What I'm saying is that if you don't try to make the best out of a game system, you're only going to find, the possible negatives rather than the possible positives, which is a very biased and one way looking at any kind of game design. You know, the thing that you should be looking at is if the game is running well, but something is still hitching, that's a problem. That's how good game design actually like works. Is the game is running as intended, but you run into a snag that is preventing the game from running as intended. That's where criticisms are very valid, and that's when they're most useful. But anyway, that's just my opinion, and you're free to dislike it and dislike this video. Or if you agree with some of this, or at the very least tolerate some of this, you can like the video and subscribe to get more tabletop content. As I talk about all things tabletop here on the channel, and I'm trying my best to make sure that we're lifting tabletop up rather than putting it down, which means looking at games that I might not be like super into, which Daggerheart is a game that I'm somewhat into anyway, and I'm doing the best I can to get the good things out of it, and when necessary, to clip off the parts that I think are making the game not work as intended. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.